Ben Mitchell had seen enough of the galaxy's dark corners to know when he'd found the absolute bottom, but Titan's Edge processing station managed to surprise him by having a basement underneath the basement. The station floated in a void between star systems like a metallic tumor, serving as the final destination for cargo that was too worthless, too dangerous, or too morally questionable for even the outer rim markets. "Welcome to Titan's Edge," announced the docking control officer through Ben's comm system, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone reading obituaries for a living. "Please state your business and prepare for mandatory biosecurity screening." "Cargo hauler Lucky Break requesting standard refueling and resupply," Ben replied, watching his fuel gauge hover just above the red line that meant, "Start writing your will." 3 months of bad cargo runs had left him broke enough that this garbage scow of a station was the only place he could afford to top off his tanks. The biosecurity screening turned out to be a rusty scanner that wheezed like it had been chain-smoking for decades, operated by a human who looked like he'd been using the same air filter. "Any biological cargo, hazardous materials, or sentient beings aboard your vessel?" "Just me and my winning personality," Ben said, trying to project the kind of casual confidence that suggested he belonged in a place like this instead of desperately hoping his credit authorization would clear. The docking bay smelled like industrial disinfectant mixed with things that probably used to be alive, and the gravity felt off. Either the generators were failing or someone had decided that standard Earth normal was too expensive to maintain. Ben made his way through corridors lined with advertisements for services he didn't want to think about too hard, following signs toward the fuel depot and trying not to make eye contact with the other patrons. Fresh off the transport, premium Vailian stock, called out a trader whose species Ben couldn't identify but whose moral character was clear from context. Guaranteed untamable, perfect for specialized processing. Ben tried to keep walking, but something in the trader's tone made him pause. Specialized processing. He'd heard that euphemism before, usually in contexts that made him wish he hadn't. "What kind of processing?" asked a potential customer whose cybernetic modifications suggested more money than conscience. "Gourmet market," the trader replied with obvious pride. "Vailian neural tissue brings premium prices in the high-end restaurants. This one's been rejected by 6 different labor contractors, so she's going straight to the meat market." Ben felt his stomach drop somewhere in the vicinity of his boots. He turned slowly, already knowing he was going to see something that would haunt his dreams, and found himself looking at a holding cage that belonged in a livestock transport rather than anywhere sentient beings should be kept. The girl inside couldn't have been more than 22, with the characteristic pointed ears and silver-scaled skin that marked her as Vailian. Her amber eyes burned with intelligence and fury despite the obvious signs of malnutrition and abuse. The silver markings along her neck and arms that should have glowed with bioluminescent patterns were dim and flickering, indicating severe stress or illness. "She's a fighter, this one," the trader continued, apparently taking Ben's horrified stare for professional interest. "Destroyed more property than she's worth as labor. Bioelectric surges every time someone tries to discipline her. But that just makes the meat more tender, if you know what I mean." Ben did know what he meant, and it made him want to introduce the trader's face to the nearest bulkhead with considerable force. "How much?" The potential customer was examining the cage like he was shopping for livestock, which, Ben realized with growing horror, was exactly what he was doing. 15,000 credits for the whole carcass, processed and ready for transport, the trader said. "That's a bargain for premium Vailian neural tissue. You won't find quality like this at the regular meat markets." "I'll take her," the customer said, reaching for his credit authorization. "Actually," Ben heard himself saying, "I'll offer 20,000. Everyone turned to stare at him. The trader's eyes lit up with the kind of greed that suggested Ben had just made a serious mistake, while the potential customer looked annoyed at being outbid for his dinner. 20,000, the trader repeated. "You're looking for processing services, or private consumption?" Ben's brain scrambled to come up with an explanation that wouldn't get him arrested or worse. "Private collection. I specialize in exotic specimens." "Ah, a connoisseur," the trader said with the kind of knowing leer that made Ben feel like he needed a shower. "Well, she's all yours for 20,000. But I should warn you, she's got a nasty habit of shocking anyone who gets too close. You'll want to keep the restraint collar activated until processing time. Right, Ben said, trying not to look at the girl's face as he activated his credit authorization. Restraint collar. Got it. The transaction took 20 minutes of bureaucratic nightmare involving health certificates, transport permits, and liability waivers that made Ben's skin crawl. By the time he'd signed all the documentation treating a sentient being as livestock, his credit balance had dropped to numbers that made his fuel gauge look optimistic. Pleasure doing business with you, the trader said, handing Ben the control unit for the restraint collar. She'll be delivered to your docking bay within the hour. Enjoy your meal. Ben managed not to vomit until he was safely back aboard his ship, where he spent 10 minutes hunched over his toilet while his conscience and his survival instincts had a violent disagreement about what he'd just done. When the delivery crew brought the cage to his cargo hold, Ben made them leave it sealed until they were gone. Only then did he approach the girl who was now, according to the legal documentation in his pocket, his property. She looked up at him with those burning amber eyes, and Ben saw no hope there, only the resigned fury of someone who had given up on rescue but refused to surrender her dignity. She said something in her native language that his translator couldn't parse, but the tone needed no interpretation. "I'm not going to hurt you," Ben said quietly, though he knew she probably couldn't understand him any better than he could understand her. "I know you have no reason to believe that, but it's true." The girl tilted her head slightly, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to determine if he was lying or just delusional. Ben looked at the cage, then at his fuel gauge, then at his credit balance, and finally at the girl whose life he'd just purchased with money he couldn't afford to spend. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "I guess we're both screwed now." The girl's silver markings flickered once, and Ben could have sworn he saw something that might have been amusement in her eyes before the fury returned. At least she had a sense of humor about their mutual predicament. They were going to need it. Ben had negotiated for a lot of strange cargo in his 15 years as an independent hauler, but arguing with a station manager about the relative value of a sentient being as labor versus protein was a new low even for him. "I don't understand the problem," said station manager Krosk, his cybernetic eye whirring as it focused on Ben with mechanical precision. "You agreed to purchase premium Vailian stock for processing. The transaction is complete." "Right, but I want to transport her alive," Ben said, trying to sound like this was a reasonable request instead of the desperate improvisation it actually was. 4. Specialized processing requirements. Krosk's organic eye narrowed while his cybernetic one continued its unsettling mechanical focusing. Specialized processing. "You mean extended torture protocols before termination?" Ben felt his conscience shrivel a little more. "Something like that, yeah." "Interesting. Most customers prefer immediate processing to preserve tissue freshness. But I suppose prolonged stress does add certain flavor compounds." Krosk consulted his data pad with the enthusiasm of someone discussing seasonal vegetables. "However, live transport requires additional documentation and insurance." "Insurance? For property damage?" "This particular specimen has a documented history of bioelectric discharge events that have destroyed equipment worth more than 50,000 credits across 6 different facilities. If she damages your ship's systems during transport." "I'll assume liability," Ben said quickly, before his brain could calculate exactly how screwed he'd be if his ship's electrical systems got fried. "Excellent. That will require a 10,000 credit insurance bond." Ben's credit authorization made a sound like a dying animal. 10,000. On top of the 20,000 purchase price. Standard rate for hazardous biological cargo, Krosk replied with the kind of bureaucratic cheer that suggested Ben's financial ruin was just another line item on today's agenda. "Unless you'd prefer immediate on-site processing. We have excellent facilities." No, live transport is fine," Ben said, watching his bank balance evaporate in real time. "But that leaves me a little short on fuel and supplies." "Ah." Krosk's mechanical eye made clicking sounds that might have been laughter. Well, we do accept alternative payment methods. Your ship's medical supplies would cover the fuel costs. Ben thought about his emergency medical kit, the one that had saved his life at least 3 times in the past year. All of it? All of it. And your spare parts inventory would cover basic life support consumables. The spare parts that kept his aging ship functioning when critical systems decided to fail at the worst possible moments. Right. And if I need to make additional purchases? We also accept personal equipment, tools, emergency rations. Krosk was clearly enjoying this. I notice your ship has backup life support systems that are worth considerable credit. You want me to sell my backup life support? Only if you want to purchase navigation fuel and basic atmospheric recycling supplies. Ben looked at his cargo manifest, which now listed 1 alien specimen, live transport, hazardous classification. Then he looked at his financial projections, which suggested he would be stranded on Titan's edge until heat death of the universe unless he liquidated everything except his underwear and possibly his kidney. Fine, Ben said, activating every credit authorization he possessed. Medical supplies, spare parts, backup life support, and my emergency rations. But I keep my tools and my coffee supplies. Naturally, Krosk agreed. No one travels the void without coffee. That would be inhumane. The irony of Krosk expressing concern for Ben's caffeine needs while treating sentient beings as livestock was not lost on either of them. The transaction took 2 hours and required Ben to sign waivers accepting responsibility for everything from property damage caused by bioelectric discharge to loss of life due to inadequate containment protocols. By the time he finished, his ship was fueled and supplied for one journey to the nearest inhabited system, provided nothing went wrong, no one got sick, and the girl didn't destroy any critical systems with her stress-induced electrical surges. Pleasure doing business with you, Krosk said, handing Ben the final documentation. Your specimen will be delivered within the hour. I do hope you enjoy your specialized processing session. Ben managed to maintain his composure until he was back in his ship's cargo hold, where he spent another 10 minutes questioning every life choice that had led him to this moment. When the delivery crew arrived with the cage, Ben noticed they were wearing full electrical insulation gear and handling the transport unit with the kind of care usually reserved for armed explosives. Fair warning, said the crew chief, setting the cage down with obvious relief, she's been getting more aggressive since the sale went through. Bioelectric output is off the charts. Ben looked at the girl through the transparent aluminum walls of her prison. Her silver markings were strobing with patterns that didn't require translation, pure, concentrated fury directed at everyone and everything around her. She understands what's happening to her, Ben realized aloud. Oh yeah, the crew chief confirmed. Vailians are smart. She knows she was sold for meat instead of labor. Makes them unpredictable when they've got nothing left to lose. After the delivery crew left, Ben approached the cage slowly, his hands visible and empty. The girl watched him with the calculating gaze of someone trying to determine if he represented immediate danger or merely inevitable doom. I know this looks bad, Ben said, even though he was pretty sure she couldn't understand standard Galactic. I know you think I bought you for the same reason everyone else wanted you. But I didn't. The girl tilted her head, her amber eyes never leaving his face. I spent my last credits to get you out of there, Ben continued, feeling ridiculous for trying to explain economics to someone who was probably planning to electrocute him at the first opportunity. Which means we're both in trouble now, because I don't have enough fuel to get anywhere civilized, and I don't have backup systems if anything goes wrong. The girl's markings shifted to different patterns, and she spoke in her native language. Ben's basic translator caught fragments, human, fool, die, together. Yeah, Ben said with a laugh that held no humor. That pretty much sums up our situation. The girl stared at him for a long moment, then did something Ben hadn't expected, she smiled. It was the kind of smile that suggested she found their mutual predicament either hilarious or insane, possibly both. Ben looked at his fuel gauge, his empty cargo holds, and the girl whose life he'd purchased with money he couldn't afford to spend. "Well," he said, "at least we'll die broke together instead of you dying alone and me dying rich." The girl's laughter sounded like silver bells mixed with electrical static, and for the first time since this disaster began, Ben thought they might actually have a chance. 3 days into their journey to nowhere in particular, Ben discovered that his new passenger had opinions about his piloting skills, and none of them were complimentary. "I know you can't understand me," Ben said, adjusting the ship's navigation for the dozenth time while the girl watched from her open cage, "but that sound you just made definitely sounded like criticism." Zephyr, he'd finally found her name in the transport documents, had been free of the cage for 2 days now, ever since Ben realized that keeping her locked up while expecting her cooperation was counterproductive. She'd responded to this freedom by conducting what appeared to be a comprehensive inspection of his ship's systems, accompanied by a running commentary in Vailian that Ben was fairly certain included unflattering observations about human engineering standards. "The navigation computer is 40 years old," Ben explained defensively. "It's vintage, not broken." Zephyr pointed at the navigation display and said something that his translator rendered as, "death trap, incompetent, miracle, still breathing." "Okay, that was definitely an insult," Ben muttered. Their communication had evolved into a bizarre mixture of broken standard Galactic, fragmentary Vailian, and interpretive gestures that somehow managed to convey basic concepts while completely failing at anything requiring nuance. Ben had learned that Zephyr understood more standard than she could speak, while she'd apparently concluded that humans were functionally deaf and required all communication to be conducted at high volume with exaggerated hand movements. The real problem wasn't communication, though, it was trust. Zephyr had made it clear that she considered Ben's rescue attempt either an elaborate deception or a temporary reprieve before some worse fate. She accepted food and medical attention with the wariness of someone expecting poison, and her bioelectric responses to stress continued to play havoc with the ship's already strained systems. "Look, we need to work together here," Ben said, watching his power consumption reading spike every time Zephyr got agitated. "My electrical systems can't handle much more of your emotional responses." Zephyr's markings flared brighter, and the lights flickered ominously. She gestured at the power coupling she'd been examining and launched into what sounded like a technical lecture delivered with considerable frustration. "Human technology, primitive, inefficient, dangerous, surprising, functional at all. Are you critiquing my power systems?" Ben asked. Zephyr nodded vigorously, then moved to another control panel and continued her commentary. This time, Ben's translator managed to catch more of the meaning: electromagnetic field distribution, completely wrong. Waste, enormous amounts, energy, simple adjustments, improve efficiency, 30%. Ben stared at her. "Are you telling me you know how to make my ship run better?" "Yes." Zephyr said in clear standard Galactic, apparently having reached the limits of her patience with his linguistic deficiencies. "Human, ships, built, wrong. Vailian, understand, electromagnetic systems, better." "Okay," Ben said slowly, "but if you modify my ship's systems and they fail, we both die." Zephyr's markings shifted to patterns that Ben was learning indicated amusement. "If, no modify, systems, fail anyway, soon. Power output, declining, life support, marginal, fuel efficiency, terrible." She wasn't wrong. Ben's ship was held together with spare parts, good intentions, and a maintenance schedule that had been more theoretical than actual for the past 6 months. If Zephyr could actually improve the system's efficiency, it might make the difference between reaching civilization and becoming another piece of space debris. "All right," Ben said, making the kind of decision that his insurance company would definitely want to know about. "But I'm going to watch everything you do, and if you try to sabotage my ship." Zephyr's laughter had the electric quality that made his fillings tingle. "Sabotage? Human, already, aboard, death trap, what, worse? I could do." What followed was the most educational 2 days of Ben's career as a starship owner. Zephyr approached his ship's systems with the focused intensity of an artist and the technical knowledge of someone who had apparently been born understanding electromagnetic theory. She recalibrated power distributions, optimized energy flow patterns, and somehow convinced his 40-year-old fusion reactor to run smoother than it had when it was new. "How do you know all this?" Ben asked, watching her rewire a control circuit with casual expertise that would have taken him hours to accomplish with a manual and considerable profanity. "Veilian, natural, electromagnetic sensitivity," Zephyr explained, her standard galactic improving rapidly as she relaxed into the work. "Feel, energy patterns, like, you feel, heat or cold. Easy, to see, where, systems, inefficient. And you learned starship engineering where?" Zephyr's markings dimmed slightly. "Before, captured, worked, maintenance, resistance ships, small fleet, hiding, outer systems." "Resistance?" Ben asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Fight, slavers, trafficking networks, rescue, prisoners, when possible." Her voice carried the weight of loss and anger. "Until, betrayed, family killed, sold, to traitors." Ben set down his tools and looked at her properly. "Zephyr, I'm sorry. I had no idea." "Why?" "Should you know?" she replied, returning her attention to the power coupling. "One more, slave, among thousands, who cares, about story?" "I care," Ben said quietly. Zephyr's hand stilled on the wiring. "Why?" It was a fair question. Ben had spent 15 years in space minding his own business, avoiding entanglements, and focusing on the kind of small-scale cargo runs that kept him fed without requiring him to think too hard about the moral implications of what he was transporting. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because you remind me that there are still things worth saving in this galaxy." Zephyr's markings cycled through several color patterns before settling on something Ben thought might indicate cautious hope. "You, really, by me, to help, not to hurt." "Yeah. Though I'm starting to think I got the better end of the deal." "How?" Ben gestured at the ship systems, which were running with an efficiency he'd never seen before. "You've improved my ship's performance by 30%, fixed problems I didn't even know I had, and probably extended my reactor's lifespan by a decade. All I did was spend money I couldn't afford." "You spent everything to save, stranger," Zephyr said firmly. "Risk, own life, for someone you never met. That, not, small thing." Ben felt heat creep up his neck. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," Zephyr said, her amber eyes serious. "Most, would not. I know, saw many, turn away, when others, needed help." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Ben learning more about starship engineering in one afternoon than he had in 15 years of amateur maintenance, while Zephyr gradually relaxed into something that might have been the beginning of trust. "Ben," Zephyr said suddenly, using his name for the first time since he'd told it to her. "Yeah. When, reach, civilization, what, happens, then?" It was the question Ben had been avoiding thinking about. Legally, Zephyr was still his property according to galactic commerce law. Practically, he had no idea how to help someone whose entire family had been killed and whose skills made her valuable to people with very bad intentions. "I don't know," he said honestly. "What do you want to happen?" Zephyr's markings flared with something that might have been determination. 3 days into their journey to nowhere in particular, Ben discovered that his new passenger had opinions about his piloting skills, and none of them were complimentary. "I know you can't understand me," Ben said, adjusting the ship's navigation for the dozenth time while the girl watched from her open cage, "but that sound you just made definitely sounded like criticism." Zephyr, he'd finally found her name in the transport documents, had been free of the cage for 2 days now, ever since Ben realized that keeping her locked up while expecting her. The rescue ship that responded to Ben's distress beacon looked like it had been designed by someone who believed that warships should be both functional and beautiful. The Free Colony's patrol vessel Starfall approached with the careful precision of experienced rescuers who had seen enough disasters to know that routine assistance was often anything but routine. Cargo vessel Lucky Break, this is Captain Sarah Chen of the FCS Starfall, came the transmission. We're responding to your distress beacon. Please state the nature of your emergency. Ben looked at Zephyr, who was monitoring their communications with the focused intensity of someone who had learned not to trust authority figures in uniform. Her markings had brightened with cautious hope when she'd heard standard Galactic spoken with a human accent that didn't carry the menace of Titan's edge traders. Starfall, this is Captain Ben Mitchell. I'm transporting a passenger who was scheduled for execution on Titan's edge processing station. We're low on supplies and in need of humanitarian assistance. There was a pause that lasted long enough for Ben to wonder if he'd just confessed to something that would get them both arrested. Lucky Break, did you say execution? Please clarify the circumstances of your passenger situation. Ben took a deep breath. She was being sold for meat, Captain. I bought her freedom, but it cost everything I had. We're running on empty and need help reaching a safe port. Another pause, this one followed by what sounded like muffled conversation in the background. Lucky Break, we're coming alongside for docking. Prepare for boarding by our cultural liaison team. Cultural liaison? Ben asked. Zephyr's markings shifted to patterns Ben had learned indicated surprise mixed with something that might have been relief. Free colonies have Vailian diplomats, she explained. If true, can speak proper language, explain situation correctly. The boarding team that came through the airlock included 3 humans and a Vailian woman whose elaborate markings and confident bearing marked her as someone accustomed to authority. She took one look at Zephyr and immediately launched into rapid conversation in their native language. Ben watched Zephyr's expression transform as she was finally able to explain her situation to someone who could understand not just her words but her cultural context. The conversation went on for 20 minutes, with both women's markings shifting through complex patterns that conveyed emotional depths Ben couldn't begin to interpret. Captain Mitchell, the Vailian diplomat said finally, turning to address him in flawless standard Galactic, I am Ambassador HFYWhen of the Free Colony's Cultural Exchange Service. Zephyr has told me what you did for her. I just bought her freedom, Ben said, feeling awkward under the scrutiny of someone whose job was probably evaluating his motives. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, Ambassador HFYWhen replied firmly, they would not have. And you did not simply buy her freedom, you bankrupted yourself to save a stranger, then trusted her with your ship and your life. That level of altruism is unusual. So what happens now? Ambassador HFYWhen consulted a data pad, her markings shifting to patterns that suggested professional consideration. Zephyr has requested asylum with the Free Colonies, which we are prepared to grant immediately. Her technical knowledge of slaving networks could be invaluable to our anti-trafficking operations. And what about Ben? Zephyr asked, her standard Galactic now flowing with the confidence of someone speaking to people who understood her perfectly. Captain Mitchell presents an interesting case, Ambassador HFYWhen admitted. Technically, he violated several commercial regulations by misrepresenting his intentions to the Titan's Edge authorities. However, those violations were committed in service of preventing what we would classify as crimes against sapience. Ben felt his stomach drop. Am I in trouble? On the contrary, Captain Chen interjected, you're exactly the kind of person the Free Colonies could use. We have a shortage of pilots willing to run high-risk humanitarian missions in contested space. You're offering me a job. We're offering you a purpose, Captain Chen corrected. Your willingness to sacrifice your financial security to save someone you'd never met suggests you might be interested in making that kind of work your regular career. Ben looked at Zephyr, who was watching the conversation with obvious interest. What kind of work, exactly? Extraction operations, Ambassador HFYWhen explained. Individuals like Zephyr who have intelligence value but are trapped in hostile territory. Rescue missions for trafficking victims. Supply runs to resistance cells operating in occupied systems. Dangerous work, Captain Chen added, but important work. And it pays well enough to keep your ship maintained and your fuel tanks full. The question is, Ambassador HFYWhen said, whether you would be interested in continuing your partnership with Zephyr. Her technical skills and insider knowledge of trafficking networks would make her an invaluable partner for covert operations. Ben turned to Zephyr, whose markings were cycling through patterns he was learning to recognize as hopeful anticipation. What do you think? Want to keep working together? You, still want, to work with me? Zephyr asked. Even though, no longer, your responsibility. Zephyr, Ben said seriously, you've saved my ship, saved my life, and taught me more about electromagnetic engineering than I learned in 20 years of amateur maintenance. If anyone should be worried about whether they're still wanted as a partner, it's me. Zephyr's markings blazed with colors that needed no translation, pure joy mixed with determination. Then, yes. Want, to keep working together. Want, to save others, like, both of us, were saved. 6 months later, the Lucky Break had been retrofitted as a covert operations vessel with the kind of advanced systems that would have made Ben's insurance company file for bankruptcy just thinking about them. Zephyr had become the Free Colony's most successful extraction specialist, while Ben had discovered that his talent for improvised problem-solving made him ideally suited for the kind of missions that required creative thinking and flexible ethics. Incoming transmission from the resistance cell on Kepler-9, Zephyr announced, her hands dancing over control systems that now responded to her bioelectric abilities as if they'd been designed specifically for Vaelian operation. They've identified a processing facility holding approximately 300 prisoners. 300. Ben studied the tactical display, mentally calculating approach vectors and escape routes. That's the biggest operation we've ever attempted. The biggest so far, Zephyr corrected, her markings bright with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. But not the biggest we will attempt. Ben activated their ship's stealth systems and began plotting a course toward Kepler-9. The Lucky Break responded with the smooth efficiency of a vessel that had been optimized by someone who understood electromagnetic systems better than the original designers. You know, Ben said, when I bought you from that station, I thought I was saving your life. You did, Zephyr replied, monitoring their approach to the jump point. But I think, maybe, I saved yours too. How do you figure? Zephyr's laughter carried the electric harmony that had become the soundtrack of their partnership. Before, you were cargo hauler, just, surviving. Now, you are, what do humans call it, hero. I'm not a hero, Ben protested. I'm just a guy with a ship who got tired of pretending the galaxy's problems weren't his business. Yes, Zephyr agreed, her amber eyes bright with affection and respect. That is exactly what hero means. As the Lucky Break jumped to hyperspace, heading toward their next impossible rescue mission, Ben reflected that he'd never expected to find purpose in the void between the stars. But sometimes the most important cargo was the kind you couldn't put a price on. Hope, dignity, and the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, people were willing to risk everything for strangers they'd never met. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those strangers became the best partners you could ever ask for.